Gentlemen, I'm going to give you both 5 minutes so you kind of go through a little bit, intros and kind of your thoughts on some of the matters relating to international partnerships in the space domain.
Great, thanks, Eric. And thanks to both of you for staying here this afternoon. You can't quite, I think that's why they keep the stage lights so bright. So, for those of you that don't know me, as mentioned, Paul Godfrey, for me, this particular part of the journey started a year ago. Almost exactly a year ago, I think, we were at the CSPO, the Combined Space Operations Forum, out in Berlin, when the CSO came over to me in a break and said, "What are you doing next year?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to our strategic command." And he said, "Well, how do you fancy coming to work for me?" I was a little bit taken aback by that. Phoned my boss immediately, and also my wife of 26 years. She said yes. And amazingly, probably down to the stuff that you do, Steve, we arrived then just 6 months later. So what is the job? The job is essentially operationalizing Partner to Win. You'll remember one of CSO's lines of effort. We could do everything, but I sat down with the team. I say the team, all four of us, at the beginning, back in June, July, and we looked at where could we have the most impact. So we settled on 3 areas. The first one is shape futures. Now, sometimes there's a little bit confusion about me looking after Futures Command or standing up Futures Command. As Gov Bratton mentioned earlier, Major General Dennis Bythewood is leading the Futures Task Force to stand up Futures Command, and they are going to sit as a field command. What we want to do in the partnerships area is just look and see how Futures Command fits into the service, and where is it international partners should come in the process that goes from essentially a good idea to something that the S5 managed and the S8 managed to get in a program. So integrating allies across all of those areas. So it needs that sort of 60,000 foot, or the geo look, in order to fit the allies and partners into there. The second part of that, shaping the future, is that Vice Chief has got me on the hook for writing, or the team, to write the international partnership strategy in concert with our friends at Sapphire. And that is something that we want to be essentially an instruction manual. The audience is internal and external. You heard CSO talk this morning about having to write some of these things down, having been in the Space Force, having been around for 5 years. So to codify how we do the force design process, where the allies and partners will need to come into that process. And then also, things that you'll be doing, Steve, is what are the processes available to them to contribute through FMS, direct military sale, direct commercial sale, those sorts of things. So hopefully an instruction manual. And actually, for industry in the room as well, we're toying with the idea of maybe a potential industry day as well to get your feedback on how that looks. In terms of the harness CSPO, which is the second area, so shape futures, harness CSPO. CSPO, if you don't know, and we can cover this more in questions, I think, because if you don't understand it, it's a 10-nation forum, Five Eyes plus France, Germany, Italy, Norway, and Japan. And that has expanded over a number of years. We went up to 10 at the end of last year, and it is harnessing the power of 10 nations together in the room, as all of these nations have now stood up their own space commands, or in New Zealand's area, space squadron. How do we harness the capabilities that they bring? How do we bring that into the force design that I've talked about? So those two are linked already. And the final one is engage NATO. Again, a huge international partnership, 32 nations, 7 of which in CSPO are direct NATO members. 3, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, are NATO aligned, and that is a thing. How do we engage with NATO to understand where they are going with their space structures, with their space command and control? What do they want to do with space? And ultimately, there was an awful lot of space commands out there, international space commands, that formed because NATO declared space an operational domain in 2019. And actually, I was fortunate to go with CSO to a NATO engagement on the 31st of October on Halloween, actually, where he spoke to the NATO Military Committee, which is a big deal. And the theme of what he talked about there, actually, as he talked about this morning, was space as a warfighting domain. So there's an element of just continuing to talk to NATO as to how they are standing up. And if I'm honest, some level of discussion to see how the nations outside of CSPO can also contribute to Allied by Design and an integrated, architected force in the future. So those are the sort of three areas we're getting with. That's a Venn diagram. The final part is just a circle around all of that, which is information sharing. I don't need to speak to many people in the room to, I'm sure most of you would tell me that in an awful lot of areas, space is overclassified because of where it's come from. You can absolutely see why in some areas it has the classification that it has, and we don't need to share everything. Everyone needs their own information that they are going to protect. But currently we are not sharing enough, and so we're trying to get after that as well. And I'll leave some time for Steve to talk about what SAP-IA do.
Yeah, thank you very much, Air Marshal. Mr. Rule?
Well, first I'd like to thank the Space Force Association for inviting me this opportunity to talk. I'd also like to thank Air Marshal Godfrey for being a partner up here. We have a lot in common in our interest for international partners, use in space, but another area where we have a common interest is we have both been a deputy to General Saltzman. You are now a deputy. When he was the A30 at Headquarters Air Force as a brigadier general, I was his deputy doing current operations. So very familiar with the CSO and what he's trying to achieve for the Space Force. As the Director for Policy Programs and Strategy, I have a number of divisions that do a multitude of programs and policies that establish how our regional affairs divisions execute security cooperation around the world. And I'd like to focus on a couple of those areas for a few seconds here before we go into Q&A. The first one is our International Airmen Division. That's where our military personnel exchange program exists, and it's also responsible for our liaison officers, our foreign liaisons officers. And frankly, each one of those agreements takes about 18 months to get accomplished, and quite a bit of paperwork through the security processes and the DDLs. And I will tell you, we set a record with Air Marshal Godfrey in getting his exchange program approved in about 4 months. And I'm going to promise that we will not do that again. So our international...
You might have to when I get fired.
I'm sorry?
You might have to when I get fired.
Okay. Well, I may not be there then. So the International Airmen Program is also responsible for the FAOs and the SCOs around the Air Force. So this is how we reach out and make contact with the international partners and establish those initial discussions on foreign military sales. So foreign military sales is an area of obviously interest to the United States and all of our partners and allies, and we're learning how to do that with our space assets now. The days of only selling GPS as a service, SATCOM, and limited shared early warning, those days are gone, and I think we're going to expand our capabilities in the future moving forward. And we need to do that in the right way. So we'll be working with Space Force, and we'll be working with Air Marshal Godfrey and the team to make sure that we establish procedures and document those in a way that everybody knows how to approach the foreign military sales process for our allies and partners in the future. Talking about information sharing, I have the Technology and Security and Foreign Disclosure Division in my directorate. In the last year and a half, I would say we've made significant inroads into information sharing. We have pushed down delegated authority for foreign disclosure officers to the field comms and MAGCOMs. Up until about 18 months ago, that did not occur. Everything occurred centrally and bureaucratically at the headquarters. So we're working to make sure that that information sharing is available to the staffs where they need it to make things happen. I will say that the TISFID process and then that process with DITSA is still a very bureaucratic process that we have to go through on a regular basis. We also have international armaments cooperation. So that area brings in about $20 billion a year in RDT&E capability across all of the services. Our portion of that is pretty significant, and the Space Force portion of that is very significant within the Department of the Air Force. Those agreements can range from an information exchange agreement to a project arrangement to a full MOU like the 5 Points MOU or the 5 Powers MOU. Each of those take different amounts of time and effort and coordination to accomplish, and we are working very hard to keep up with the demand, and the demand is significant. And then the last area I wanted to bring up is our weapons division. Our weapons division, about a year ago, published the first ever STAR baseline. A baseline in SAF-IA is a exportability document that details what we believe in the next 5 to 7 years is what we think is able to export to specific countries. It is at the no foreign level. It is available for industry to come to our offices and read and understand what they can do. That STAR baseline was the first ever for Space Force. We have 12 other baselines across mission areas within the Department of the Air Force, and we will start our review of the STAR baseline in March, hopefully trying to publish a new updated version within about a year from that time frame. So those are the things that we're doing right now in SAF-IAP and SAF-IA to help our agreements and our interaction and interoperability with partners and allies around the world. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rule. So we'll jump right in, and this is a question that I'll pose to both of you. It's a pretty high-level question, but just want to get a few remarks. What are the benefits of collaboration, and what does it bring? And Air Marshal, if you could answer.
I'll kick off with one. One is deterrence, because if we can get to that, well, just the fact, if you take CSPOke last week, the fact that there are 10 nations in a room talking about how we are going to collaborate together, where we are going in terms of integrated by design, those integrated architectures of the future, I can't see the same forum with our potential adversaries. And certainly, I think it was 2 years ago, in June of 2022, NATO, after one of their conferences, issued a communique that Article 5 in space is valid. And so that enormously increases the risk calculus for our potential adversaries when it comes to, are they going to take the first move? And it was General Saltzman's theory of endurance in terms of deny first mover advantage. Denying first mover advantage by being part of a coalition, I think, is the best thing that you could do.
So I would add, because of collaboration, we will end up with significant efficiencies, which I think is important to all of us individually as nations, but also as partners and allies. That efficiency can be found in cost and funding. It can be found in capability deployments. And that efficiency is also added interoperability for all of us in a warfighting environment. So I think all of these are very good reasons for this collaboration.
Well, just I'll add one more. If you were in here for Clint Clark's and Chief Lurch's, I thought was an awesome threat brief. Actually, you could see the essentially irresponsible behaviors that certain nations commit in space. Now, that has gone on in the shadows over the last few years. But again, more and more nations standing up their own space commands, understanding more about space domain awareness, being able to look around their own satellites. There are more and more nations who are willing to call out and attribute irresponsible behavior. And stability in the space domain requires responsible space behaviors. And so again, by collaborating, by sharing information, then we can all make the space domain safer.
Thank you for that insight. And taking from understanding the benefits, I think it's really important to see where the future opportunities come into play. And so, based on your experience, especially being from the UK and then here and having that cross connection, what do you see, and where do you see further opportunities for the Space Force to partner with allies? And Mr. Rule, after he's done, I would love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think from a Space Force perspective, it is what I mentioned about the international partnership strategy. It is about working with stakeholders within the DoD, and given what Steve talked about right at the beginning, you can start to understand the complexity from a service within the Department of the Air Force with everything that SAF-AA does, and I would like to publicly thank you guys for everything you do. This is my second exchange in the US, and the first one 25 years ago, and SAF-AA were crucial to that on another military partner exchange program. But then you've also got, we were out in Florence last week for that Combined Space Operations Forum with OSD Policy, the Office of the Secretary of Defense as well. Everyone is engaging with partners in all of those areas. And you look at the service itself, and you will have frontline, the component field comms, geographically located in partner nations who will be having conversations with a range of different nations as well. And all of the field comms that you've heard from today are engaging with international partners. So you can see the complexity of this when the service sits down to start to write a strategy as to how we're going to do it. So in terms of the opportunity here, I think it is a clear and simple instruction manual so that DoD, intelligence community, industry, commercial, and allies and partners all understand what we are trying to achieve and the mechanisms by which we will achieve them. If I get it right, it'll look like an IKEA instruction manual rather than 78 pages of text. But that's where I see the biggest opportunity at the moment. And just doing this work and bringing all of the different stakeholders in is fascinating in itself. And I think we're definitely going in the right direction.
Thank you for that, Mr. Rule.
Yeah, the only thing I would like to add is, and this is an Air Force story, but if you look at the F-35, there will be 600 F-35s in Europe when we're all done. 50 of those will be US. This goes back to the NDAA 18, is we are dependent on our allies and partners as a United States to do warfighting in the future. We always have been, but we're more dependent now, and that is in spades in space. So we really have to work this very hard to make sure that those spacefaring countries that we work with on a day-to-day basis provide the capabilities that will benefit the coalition in warfare, because as you saw in the threat briefing this morning, the Chinese are building up capacity and capability that we have to be able to match and counter.
Can I add
Absolutely.
I was going to say 30 seconds. It's bound to be more than 30 seconds. But in terms of what can the Space Force do, I think there's a level of mentoring for allies and partners. F-35, I think, is a fantastic example of what can be done, but that's with partners that have had air forces for, upwards of 100 years, and are fully settled and understand what they do and have got large budgets. As I say, it's probably, it is. France stood up, were the first allied nation to stand up at Space Command in 2019, 2020, and then the United Kingdom, Australia, Germany, and it sort of snowballed from there. These are still really, we talk about the Space Force being young, but you all, see I'm learning American, were doing this for a long time, but just happened to be within the Air Force. We only had pockets of these things going on in all of the other nations around the world. So the Space Force does have a role in mentoring all of these nations, and US Spacecom as well, in terms of the operational side of things. But mentoring other air forces, not only in how you stand up the sorts of things that you need to concentrate on, but that's sort of from the right-hand edge of what we term the objective force that Gov Bratton and the team are putting together, and where the allies might want to spend their money in terms of bringing capability into the future. So, it's an ongoing conversation.
Thank you for that. And We're going to move on to a question that I think was kind of, it's obvious, it's probably in every single panel, is the commercial sector and academia are key sources of innovation. We know this, we see this. The growth in the commercial sector has been tremendous. So how do you see our security cooperation activities facilitating those interactions with commercial and academia? Mr. Rule?
So it's not new, it's new in space, I would put it that way. So direct commercial sales exist in foreign military sales for the last 70 years. We're trying to figure out right now, as we move forward, and we heard one of the panels today talking about commercial capabilities, we have to figure out where is that sweet spot between the commercial production and development of capabilities that governments can use, but then from a warfighting perspective, how do we put the uniform into the loop for the decision making of how to respond to threats against those capabilities? I think we have a lot of work to do in this area and a lot to discuss.
From an innovation perspective, certainly my old job as the commander of UK Space Command, this was the hardest thing because innovation is happening everywhere, all of the time. And so how do you horizon scan? I think Gov mentioned this earlier today. How do you horizon scan to find the silver bullet in amongst everything that's going on? So what processes do you have? And then is your acquisition system flexible enough to be able to go from what you thought you wanted to what you've just discovered and get a development program over what we term the Valley of Death into a program of record to then be funded as part of your budget for the future? At the moment, that is almost impossible. You get examples of this running through, and I think there's a lot of people thinking about how we might change the system from requirements through to defense acquisition in order to take account for the amount of, or the continuous innovation that's happening in the space sector. Because someone already mentioned it today, certainly our potential adversaries, and certainly China is doing this amazingly well. And if we're going to be competitive, we're going to have to do something different.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for those remarks and insights. I see we have a little bit more time, and so I would love to open up for at least one or two questions from the audience, if we can. Any questions out there that you'd like to ask the panelists?
We're going to lock the doors until there's a question.
Got one over there?
I'll just shout.
Oh, there it is.
There we go.
Yep.
Well, first of all, gents, thanks a lot for making yourselves available for questions. My question in particular is, the current timeline for international agreements tends to be 2 to 3 years. How do we reconcile that with the current threat environment, and how can we do better?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wouldn't say it's 2 to 3 years. I would say a project arrangement is taking 15 months. An MOU will take 18 to 20, 21 months. But I'm parsing, so I apologize for that. You're right, it takes too long. We're working with OSD policy right now. We're working with OSD A&S to figure out what is the tool that we can use to get our international agreements accelerated. Part of this is actually, in a bilateral agreement, there's two countries that have vested and perhaps different interests or different resourcing capacity. And the negotiation phase of an international agreement is probably the most extensive phase. Now, we can fix the staffing phase, and I will share with you, we'll put packages into OSDP, and it will take 2 to 3 months for them to sign off on it. That, I think, we can work internally, but the negotiation phase is always going to be the longest part of an international agreement. Does that make sense?
Sir, appreciate it. Thank you.
I'll just make a quick point on it. We do need to speed up the timeline on this. I guess we always think that it's going to be all right on the night, in that as soon as a crisis starts happening, the barriers stop and we do what we need to. And Ukraine has proven that with the amount of international agreements and MOUs and things that have allowed all of the aid to get into Ukraine. But relying on that is not good enough. So it comes back to Steve's point of, what can we do, including the negotiation phase, in order to speed up these things? What are the critical agreements so that we can prioritize these and work on those top ones so that we don't have to wait for a crisis in order for the barriers to come down and for it to happen?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for that question. We have another one? Awesome.
Hey, good evening. Thank you both for sacrificing your happy hour time to meet with us. I have a question primarily for Mr. Rule, but it would invite input, of course, from Air Marshal Godfrey. I'm the Deputy of Foreign Military Sales at SSCIA. We've been working with the SAF-IA team day in, day out on the growing caseload. We're seeing countries requesting capabilities that just haven't been exported, period, right? Not either by DCS or FMS. And we're now seeing TISFID as kind of the primary, I won't want to say single point of failure, but the most integral part of the process that is hard for us to impact. I'm just wondering from your perspective if you see any need from the SAF-IA side to either realign resources or look into potential changes to policy to account for space in the TISFID realm. And I know it's a topic that quickly delves into potentially classified, and we're in a public setting, so whatever you're able to speak to that.
Yeah, so you have to remember in the TISFID process, there's 13 voting members, and I won't go through who those are. And each one of those voting members have a different perspective and a different effort that they feel that they have to protect. I will say that the Department of the Air Force is recognized within the TISFID as leaning forward. There are other departments in the DoD, and I won't name them, that are not as leaning forward, and they have their reasons. We have been very successful at getting a lot of these barriers broken down, but it takes a lot of time to do it. We are working hard with our space baseline, with the STAR baseline, that will help us start that education process with the other members of the TISFID to understand that there are capabilities that have been in existence for periods of time, and there are follow-on capabilities for that capability. Perhaps we can share that initial capability faster for our allies and partners. These are some of the examples that we're going through right now. To your point, yes, the TISFID process for space is taking an extensive amount of time for SAF-IAP, and we are continuing to work it.
I guess the point I'll contribute is the view, again, in my last job as the commander of UK Space Command, in that you want to develop relevant capabilities and capabilities that will be interoperable. But a lot of the time, you don't know what is available. You just don't know what you don't know. So I think there is a role for the United States Space Force with SAF-IA to determine where it is we want allies and partners to fill potential gaps or to plus up on capabilities and prioritize those capabilities for declassification potentially, and then conversations with allies. Because certainly, as I mentioned in a previous life, you just don't know what you don't know. So what you then have to do as an ally is use what are pretty limited budgets and resource to go and try and invent capabilities that may have been on the shelf in the US for the last 10, 15 years. And that will take up time and resource that we just can't afford given the scale of what everyone knows is the threat in the domain.
Thank you both. I did want to shout out to Major Caggiano. I know she couldn't make it, but she's also been a great space weapons officer to work with, so appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll pass that on to Ms. Siebold.
Thank you very much. Looks like we're running out of time here. Do you gentlemen have time for just one more question?
If people in the audience have time for one more question.
All right, we're going to do one more, this side.
All right. Even gentlemen, I'll be quick with this question. Earlier today, we heard some panels, particularly on the commercial side, talking about interoperability. I'm curious as to what efforts are being taken to drive the conversation between our allies and their commercial entities within those countries to increase that interoperability and ensure that that exists as those systems are being developed, given the nascent nature of the space business today.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we are looking at CSPO and NATO as being two bodies that can drive standardization. If you just take, if you were in here earlier, I did ask a question about data, and is there a single body that could potentially force data standards from a space perspective within the US? Because I think if you do it in the US, you are starting to drive it across the world. But there's other things as well. Take in-space refueling, where if you end up with company-derived solutions and the equivalent of a probe and drogue, if you take air-to-air refueling in the air domain, you start driving expense up. And again, budgets are small, and you're going to have to pick one. And so I think the more we mature the conversations amongst CSPO nations and with NATO, and NATO has always been an organization that has done standardization agreements, STANAGs, which used to be a big thing across the Cold War. We've just sort of drifted away from it a little bit. But I think it's those international forums that can start driving these things and pick the standards that we require. And actually, if there isn't a particular standard, I would highlight Derek Tournier and Space Development Agency for just publishing standards that they are using that then you could choose to adopt or not. But it is a complex area that we're going to just have to start chipping away.
I would add, I think General Cropsey and the work he's doing with JADC2 ABMS, that will have repercussions in space as well, and that standardization at the system level is critical to future warfighting. It will allow us all to have basic standards that we all understand through our individual nations' industry, that if they build to that, we will come to it, much like the iPhone. That's where we're headed. I think that will help with the interoperability and the cost capability.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for that question. Air Marshal Godfrey, Mr. Rule, thank you for participating today. And thank you all for coming out for this discussion.
Thank you.